Hello, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion that I will be having with Emilio Dabed, who is a board member of the Legal Center for Palestine. My name is Bill Skidmore. I'm also with the Legal Center for Palestine. Um, Emilio, one of the things I was thinking about in asking you to have this conversation is Canada, we've recently had a federal election. And one of the themes there, and even outside of the election, is, this isn't our concern what happens somewhere else in the world. We shouldn't expect our government to have to take a position to do anything. That's in another country. Why are we getting involved? I've even noticed increasingly this is even being said by people who very much support what Israel is doing and say, that's happening over there. Why are we concerned? Why are we advocating a position against that? So it's a way of pushing aside this issue. But I want to talk to you about because we actually, and Emilio is a professor of international law, and we have a situation where, in fact, Canada has legal obligations, not just a question of what morally we should be doing, but in fact, we have to do certain things legally. So that's why I've invited you here today to focus on that, but specifically as well with a statement of claim against the Canadian state for failing to uphold its international legal obligations to prevent genocide and focusing on the case of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. The Legal Center for Palestine is doing this together with several other parties as part of a coalition for Canadian accountability in Gaza. So welcome, Emilio. There's quite a bit for us to cover to get through on this issue. But hopefully we can make sense of it so people will understand why this case has come about, where it's going, and what we hope to achieve by linking with other parties to bring this case forward. So first, could you give, let's say, a brief summary of why was the case initiated and where in the legal process, the legal proceedings, is it currently at?
Thank you, Bill. Well, I mean, regarding your first comment about people saying, well, why should we be concerned about what is going on in Gaza? It's so far away. Why should the Canadian government take a position? Well, I think people who think like that make a big mistake. I think there are good reasons to be concerned about what is going on in Gaza. One of them is political, and the other is legal. The political reason is that we have been for I think more than 18 months now watching a televised genocide, and I think nobody, no institution, no state in the world has been willing or capable of stopping it. The violations of international law, the commission of different kinds of war crimes is more than evident. And politically speaking, I think it's very important to be concerned about that, because I think the message coming from Gaza today is quite clear and at the same time quite terrifying, which is that for global elites today, genocide is or became a political alternative. I don't know if people measure the gravity of it. It's a possible political alternative that is not only possible in Gaza. Today, it will become possible anywhere. I mean, we actually see, right, as a direct effect of it, the conflict today between India and Pakistan, and people who follow that immediately realized the clear parallel between what Israel is doing in Gaza and what Indians and Indian authorities are saying that they should do in Kashmir. right? They are talking about to implement the Israeli model. And the Israeli model is basically genocide and ethnic cleansing.
And I,
So, so politically speaking, you see, is a very concerning development in the sense that uh, the genocide is not only a political alternative in Gaza or against Palestinians, but it is becoming a political alternative for any kind of conflict.
it
This
was
the
just, I was going to note from the bit of reading I've done about, and this is still new at the time of recording this interview, India's incursions or potential incursions into Pakistan, and but using the language, we must fight terrorism. Terrorism
right.
is the great evil. And we've obviously seen that for decades, Israel's discourse around Palestine. But with what they've done in Gaza as well, it's a fight against terrorism. They don't say it's a fight against the Palestinian people. It's not a fight against Palestine, it's against terrorism, although in reality, those who suffer, those who are affected, those who are targeted are overwhelmingly not armed actors, but are civilians.
So the first reason to be concerned about Gaza is a political reason, and is this political reason, right? This development is becoming an alternative for any conflict in the world. But there is also a legal reason, right? Which is that Canada, as a signatory of the Genocide Convention, right, it has international legal obligations. This is not just a moral question. It's also, of course, a moral question, but it's more than simply a moral question. It's a legal question. It's a very objective legal question. And Canada has obligations under international law to prevent genocide. And this obligation to prevent genocide was if before the decisions and the interventions of the International Court of Justice, if before the first decision of the International Court of Justice in the case of genocide from South Africa against Israel, if before this, the intervention of the court, some states could maybe argue that there was no genocide or there was no risk of genocide, and that therefore they were not legally bound to take a position. Well, from an international law point of view, the obligation to prevent genocide, which is clear, a positive obligation in the Genocide Convention, this obligation to prevent genocide by third states was clearly triggered once the ICJ decided in January 2024 that a genocide taking place in Gaza was plausible, right? At this very moment, any doubt about the obligations of third states to prevent genocide was clearly it was clarified
Well, you made a,
because
I was going to say you made an interesting point. It was totally clarified. There was no doubt anymore, as per the ICJ January 2024 decision. But my understanding is that Canada and any other state's obligation to intervene to prevent genocide was triggered as soon as there was evidence that genocidal actions were occurring, and that intent, in fact, to commit genocide was evident. So if we step back into the autumn of 2023 after October 7th, uh, can you talk about at what point do you think Canada had an obligation without even hearing the decision of the International Court?
well, look, I mean, um, in a mentally healthy world, one could perfectly argue that the obligations to prevent genocide were triggered long before the intervention of the ICJ, because long before the intervention of the ICJ, not only the intentions publicly declared, stated by the Israeli leadership were very clear, but because also these intentions were followed up by acts, genocidal acts, there was no doubt for many, right, of us that what was going on there was a genocide. But yeah, states, can argue that this is not evident, that this is not clear, that, this is an accusation that is very serious and that cannot be done, without evidence, etc. So it could be argued before the intervention, if before the intervention of the ICJ, it could be argued that, these obligations had not been yet triggered. Well, after the intervention of the ICJ, these obligations became very, very clear, right? And to respond to your second question, why did we initiate these legal proceedings? Well, precisely because we saw that during month and month after the decisions of the ICJ declaring a genocide plausible in Gaza, Canada had not done anything meaningful to use its relationship with Israel and the leverage that Canada could exert on Israel in order to prevent any of the actions that the ICJ had considered in order to make the decision that it made, right? So, this is why we initiated the legal proceedings. Now, many of us were appalled, right, by the fact that this is the first time that actually someone or some organization has to push the Canadian government to do something about a genocide. And that was very appalling. Why? Because Canada had been very eager historically to intervene in other cases of genocide, and Canada had shown in its interventions, for example, in the case of Rohingyas in Myanmar, in Serbia, Bosnia case, but if I remember well, also in the case of Russia, Ukraine, Canada had made very strong statements, and in its intervention in those cases, Canada was pushing for a very active and very aggressive position in terms of saying that these crimes could not be or could not benefit from impunity, that the responsible people should be prosecuted, and more than that. And this is the interesting part of the precedent interventions of Canada in other cases of genocide, is that Canada, in those interventions, was putting forward the idea that the court should be very flexible in terms of what evidence the court would consider and how the court would consider this evidence. Why Canada was advocating for flexibility in the interpretation of the convention and in the consideration of the evidence. Well, because the Canadian government is perfectly aware that, and they were saying that it's very difficult. One of the most difficult points to prove in a case of genocide is this special intent that the convention requires in order to call a genocide a genocide. What do I mean? That just killing people or injuring people or destroying civilian infrastructure is not necessarily a genocide, because the crime of genocide requires a special intent, which is positively described in the convention itself, requires the particular intention of destroying in whole or in part a group of people. And that requirement is very difficult to prove. And Canada was, and other interveners in those cases were perfectly aware that if the court was not flexible in the consideration of the evidence, to the extent, for example, of considering circumstantial evidence, that all put together could actually prove the intent to destroy in whole or in part a group. If this flexibility was not applied, it would be almost impossible to convict those responsible for the genocides.
And let me come back to this point. I think you're saying because intent is not usually clearly and openly and forcefully expressed by those committing genocide. And yet, here we are in the case of Gaza and Israel's genocide there. The expressions of intent by Israeli officials are public and they're plentiful. There's no doubt there. So Canada was saying in other cases, because intent is normally hidden, that you look at other factors from which you deduce that, in fact, genocide is occurring. For instance, I understand one of their considerations would be how many children are being killed. And is that, do you know anything about that? Is that a factor, how one judges? Now, again, to be clear in this case, in Gaza, the intent is clear. There's no doubt. But in a case where it isn't as clear, would they not look at, for instance, how many children were being killed as an expression of a genocidal objective?
Absolutely. So this is what makes of the inaction of the Canadian government regarding the genocide in Gaza so appalling, right? Because how should we understand this double standard? While in Myanmar, in the Rohingyas case, in Serbia-Bosnia case, in the Ukraine-Russia case, in all these cases, Canada was advocating for flexibility in order to evaluate and consider the evidence, to the extent of advocating for the consideration of circumstantial evidence that all put together could prove the intent that is effectively so difficult to prove because in general is hidden. Well, in the case of Gaza, where the intent is not hidden at all, is actually stated as public policy, right? In this case, the Canadian government did not see any intent, any genocidal intent. Well, we understand, we perfectly understand why is that, right?
I mentioned the case just a second here, Emilio, Russia and the Ukraine, that Canada came on board, claimed that in fact that was a genocide, and just by the numbers of killed, there were far fewer civilians killed, non-combatants in Ukraine by Russia than Palestinians in Gaza, and not just absolute numbers, but as a percentage of the population, far greater in Gaza than in the case of Ukraine. It's
Bill, because the crime of genocide is not about numbers. You see, it's not about numbers. It doesn't matter if you kill 3,000 or 100,000, as long as there is an intent that can be proven, right? So the proof of that is that the case of Serbia, Bosnia, right, in which the court found that effectively it was a genocide. In the case of, in this case, only, and I say only, one is too much, but only 8,000 people were killed, right? so you don't need numbers necessarily in order to qualify as something as a genocide, but rather the intent. Well, in the case of Gaza, we have numbers, we have clear statements of intent that were actually declared as public policy. And they have been reiterated in so many occasions. So there is no doubt. And that made the inactions of Canada really appalling, right? And that forced us to confront Canada with its legal obligations under international law. This is why we initiated this case.
Let me ask one more small point on this. It's massive, really, but it's to destroy in whole or in part. It's not to wipe out or intend to wipe out an entire society. But my understanding as well, it's not just about killing either. So let me ask you, for instance, what has been done to Palestinian civilians or non-combatants, to children in particular, obviously affects us so much when we see the scenes, but there are many scenes of people not killed, but people badly wounded, maimed, burned, facilities, civilian facilities, as you've called it, civilian infrastructure, schools, uh, hospitals, especially religious institutions, cultural institutions, those also having been destroyed. This is part, is it not, of what counts in a genocide, not simply killings, but woundings, other harms that are done as well. Is that a correct understanding?
I mean, the Genocide Convention, the Genocide Convention actually what it does, it defines genocide in a rather complex way, because what it does is to enumerate a series of acts, okay, among them killing, injuring, creating conditions that make life impossible, controlling the reproduction of the group. I mean, a series of acts, right? Now, those acts, according to the convention, become genocidal when they are perpetrated with the intention of destroying in whole or in part. Okay, so there are many ways of committing the crime of genocide. Effectively, as you say, it's not only by killing. You can injure people, you can maim people, you can destroy the conditions of life, you can prevent the reproduction of the group. All these acts are genocidal acts, forms of committing a genocide, which will be qualified as a genocide when they are accompanied by the positive intent to destroy in whole or in part this group.
One thing that is often said here is that Canada, a large landmass, but a small population, not a huge population, 40 some million. We're not a big power, or people used to say a middle power, whatever that really meant or means anymore. But they'll say, well, why expect Canada alone to stand up and challenge this? But I'm interested, two things are, what are the obligations, even if you challenge alone? And to what degree does that depend on your capacity to influence? And what capacity does Canada, in fact, have? And what is said in conventions or legal judgments that interpret the conventions in terms of acting with other third-party states, not saying we have to go on our own, but with others. So what is Canada capable of doing on its own because of its particular relationship with the state of Israel? And secondly, what are our obligations to act in concert with other states?
Effectively, there is case law that court decisions, right, that have interpreted these obligations, right? And today there is a quite clear consensus in the doctrine, in the case law, from scholars of international law, right? That the obligation to prevent genocide is a contextual and relational obligation, right? That what you are meant to do depends on the kind of relationship you have with the state accused of being committing a genocide, right? So your obligation is not necessarily to stop the genocide, because in many cases, some states do not have the ability to do so, right? So the obligation is not to prevent genocide, but rather, is not to actually prevent genocide, but the obligation is actually to put in place all measures in your power, depending on the relationship you have, right, in this case with Israel, to put in place all the measures that exist in your power that could actually put pressure on the other state to stop the genocidal actions, right? So so um, so the obligation is actually to do everything you can or is in your power, right? According to the particular relation that you have with this other state, right? In order to stop, to discourage, or to prevent this state from carrying on. Right? So what does it mean in the case of Canada? Canada has a long-standing relationship with Israel, a very friendly, long-standing relationship with Israel. And this relationship materializes in several ways, right? A strong diplomatic relations, also some programs, bilateral agreements of strategic cooperation with Israel, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So Canada was meant, right, to take measures that, sorry, Bill. So Canada was, for example, meant to maybe suspend diplomatic. What could Canada do given its relationship with Israel, right? Well, Canada could have recalled its ambassadors. Canada could have threatened Israel with the suspension of diplomatic relations. Canada could have put pressure on Israel, for example, by suspending arms trade with Israel. It could have put pressure on Israel by stopping the selling of weapons to Israel. It could have also cracked down on illegal activities that were performed in Canadian territory in support of the Israeli army, like, for example, some Canadian organizations organizing or facilitating the recruitment of Canadians to go to fight for the Israeli army in Gaza, which is actually criminal in Canada, right?
The recruitment is currently illegal, but apparently not actually serving. It's the recruiters that are held legally liable, not the individuals who go and fight for what is deemed a friendly country, that being Israel deemed that way. Would there be possibilities, nevertheless, to focus on the actual combatants who go from here? And there's also another level to this as well. Not all Canadians are permanent residents, who have gone to join in the genocide have been armed actors, but they've been support people as well for the military. So not in a combatant role, but vital roles that help military to function, provision of food, health services, etc. That's a bit of a digression, but those are possibilities. One already in law in terms of, I think it's called the Foreign Enlistment Act, the recruiting. Is there anything in law? Am I mistaken? There isn't anything that that could convict, charge people, I should say, with joining in the Israeli military, um, short of having committed specific war crimes individually. Is how would Canada should have handled that and could have handled it?
Well, look, I think what Canada could have done is to prevent the recruitment. That is a clear action
Yes.
that Canada could have taken. Now, if the Canadian government will make the decision of prosecuting people who went there to fight or to support otherwise the Israeli army, this is a political decision that I cannot foresee or explain. We will see. What the fact is that we will be initiating actions against Canadians that either because they are binationals, Canadian Israelis, or Canadians that went to fight there. We are preparing files to submit them to the Canadian authorities, seeking criminal prosecution of those individuals. We will see what happens. But to come back to your initial question about, okay, what is this obligation to prevent genocide? First thing that people should understand is that the obligation to prevent genocide is not triggered only when a genocide is happening or when a genocide has been committed, right? It's an obligation to prevent it. So actually, you don't need a genocide to be happening necessarily, but what you need is a risk of a genocide happening, and this risk was clear to the Canadian leadership from the very beginning. And they did not do anything. So that forced us to confront Canada with its own legal obligations that the Canadian state was so keen to uphold in previous cases of genocide, right? Now, what does it mean, this obligation to prevent genocide? Well, again, the case law and scholarly work is clear in the sense that this obligation is a contextual and relational obligation, and therefore depends on the particular relationship of the Canadian state with Israel in this case, how this relationship materializes, and how this materialization of the relationship between these two states allows Canada to put pressure on Israel to stop genocidal actions, right? And more specifically, right, Canada could have made a decision regarding diplomatic relations, recalling its ambassadors, or summoning the Israeli ambassadors in Canada. Canada could have also stop or prevent the recruitment of Canadians to go to fight for the Israeli army. Canada could have stopped the arms trade with Israel. Canada could have stopped trade in general with Israel, right? So there is a very wide range of measures that Canada could have taken, and it didn't. And we actually indicate enumerate them, describe them in our legal submission.
The legal submission, Emilio, it focuses, I believe, exclusively on Canada's obligation to prevent. Is that correct? Or does it speak at all to, I believe there's also an obligation to punish uh, around genocide. I don't know if the case touches that, though.
Actually, to explain the case itself, the case basically what we are asking from the court is a declaratory relief, and what is that? It's the response to a question, actually to two questions that we are asking in our submission. We are asking the court to uh, to declare whether or not Canada has violated its obligations under international law to prevent genocide. This is the first question. And the second question is whether or not, by doing so, if Canada violated its obligations under international law to prevent genocide, how, by doing so, it at the same time violated charter rights of Canadian citizens who are our clients, right? So this is what a declaratory relief is, right? We are asking the court to declare whether or not is Canada violated its obligations under international law to prevent genocide, and to declare if, by doing so, Canada effectively, as we argue, violated also charter rights of Canadian citizens. Basically, the right to equality and the right to security and life.
The particular Canadian citizens, though, are of Palestinian origin. And I assume that is key in this as well because of the suffering that they have incurred personally and collectively through families and communities. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. One of them was in Gaza on the 7th of October. He was under bombardment. He tried to escape from Gaza several times. He couldn't. He was basically moving around in a war zone, uh, enduring all the hardship and danger that a war zone represents, and he was actually injured before he left Canada, right? So clearly his life and security were put at risk. And in the second case, in the case of equality, the right to equality, because one of our clients was not in Gaza, but his family was, and he applied for the evacuation of his family relatives, right, from Gaza, and until today, if I don't mistake, there is no one from his family that has actually gotten to Canada, right? Some of them left Gaza, part of the family, not all of them, but none of them has reached Canada, actually. And we think that the only explanation for that, when you compare these to other emergency programs of the same nature, for example, for Ukrainians, well, Canada offered to Ukrainians, and rightly so, I think, right? Offered to Ukrainians a very expeditious program that brought thousands of Ukrainians to Canada in a record time, and they were offered benefits and securities, right? That were necessary, and we are happy that in the case of Ukrainians, Canada did that. But our point is that in the case of Palestinians from Gaza, Canada failed to operate in the same way. And we think that the reason for that is only a discriminatory reason.
And there's pushback from, what can I call them, mainstream Zionist organizations here who say to let people from Gaza in is to let terrorists in. We must be so afraid of that. But that is a political statement, an unfair one. And the government still has an obligation, regardless of the pressure put on them by such organizations. Can you tell me, we just have a couple more minutes really here. So Canada, you're arguing, has failed to fulfill its obligations under the Genocide Convention and other international law. What, besides the case you have, which is with these individual plaintiffs, can anything else happen to Canada? Is there any other penalty or repercussions for the Canadian state for having violated its obligations to uphold the Genocide Convention? I don't know if there any are, and even if there are they enforceable?
Right. From our legal action, no, because we are only seeking a declaratory relief, a declaration from the court in the sense that I already told you, a response to these two questions. Now, yes, the responsibility of Canada could be how do you say? Canada could be held accountable, liable, and responsible for its violations because of its violation of Canada's obligations under international law to prevent genocide. But that would need to be sought by another state.
By another state or by
Right.
the International
Right.
Court of Justice?
Right, because this would be a violation of the Genocide Convention, and the Genocide Convention says that disputes between states, right, regarding the interpretation or application of the convention are resolved or decided by the ICJ. So the only possibility of materializing the responsibility and liability of Canada because of its omissions in action to prevent genocide could be done through or by another state, right, at the ICJ. Now, it doesn't mean that the legal action that we initiated does not have any other effects, because, and this is a very important part, I think that people need to know, is that this case is only one part of a broader strategy for Canadian accountability in Gaza. Now, what do I mean by that? Is that we believe that this case, if we get a favorable decision by the court, this case will put us in a much better standing to seek justice with other legal actions. Why I'm saying that? Because but until now, Canadian authorities basically deny any responsibility and very often deny that a genocide is going on in Gaza, right? So that would have to change if a court, a Canadian court, said or declared that actually according to the court and not according to LCP or other civil society organizations, but according to Canadian courts, effectively Canada has violated its obligations to prevent genocide, right? That we think would open windows to many and facilitate many other legal actions that we are already preparing. So, for example, seeking criminal prosecution of Canadians who participated in the war in Gaza, would be facilitated by such a declaration from the court. Why I'm saying that? Because people may not know that genocide is a crime under Canadian legislation. Because the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act of 2000 incorporated into Canadian law the Rome Statute, right? And so criminalized in domestic Canadian legislation several crimes, among them the crime of genocide, right? But this act of 2000, the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act of 2000, establishes that in order to prosecute anyone for the crimes described in the act, among them genocide, you need actually the consent of the Attorney General. And given
the Canadian, just to be clear, the Attorney General of Canada, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So and when you sue the Canadian government or the Canadian state, well, it's precisely him who defends, right? So he represents the Canadian state. So it's very difficult to imagine that the Attorney General would consent to the prosecution of anyone for a crime of genocide that the Canadian government is systematically denying.
Yes, and who are their colleagues as well in the same political party and
Absolutely.
cabinet.
Absolutely. But we believe that a declaration from a Canadian court in that sense would make much more difficult for the Attorney General to simply decline his consent. And that would put us in a much better position to even challenge the decision of the Attorney General, that even though it's a discretionary decision, is quite clear in the Canadian legal system that discretion is not a synonym of arbitrariness, right? That discretion doesn't mean that the person can do whatever the person wants. No. Discretion is not a synonym of arbitrariness, and there are some standards that a discretionary decision needs to meet. And we believe that if the Attorney General declined his consent to criminally prosecute in those cases, we think that his decision would not meet the requirements of those standards. So sorry, just to finish the idea. So a declaration from the courts in this case would open the door and put us in a much better situation to initiate criminal legal actions, but also civil actions for tort and other actions that I prefer not to reveal now because they are in preparation. But the point is that this case, we believe, can open a door, a big door, right, for Canadian accountability in Gaza within the Canadian legal system.
Well, I mean, this is important. And again, what we all know from not just with the genocide in Gaza, but, decades of Israeli oppression of Palestinians, they are never held accountable. There's impunity rules. But we're also trying here to hold our officials and other individuals who have participated in illegal acts and just heinous illegal acts, that there will be accountability, but this will be at least a long legal road. But the hopes is it is leading somewhere. There will be accountability within this country, which will then prevent Canada to continue its support for the state of Israel and the crimes it commits against Palestinians. I think, is that a fair summary of that? Emilio, our time has elapsed, and I always like talking to you. You have so much to offer, but we should wrap up. I just wanted to ask any final thoughts, anything we've missed that you would like to convey to the people who are observing and watching this video?
Yeah, I think it's important for people to know that, well, yes, the law has this very frustrating characteristic, which is that the law always operates after the facts,
Mhm.
right? And we don't pretend and we don't pretend that what we are doing will actually stop the genocide in Gaza. But what we believe is that it's our responsibility to hold those complicit or supporting the genocide in Gaza accountable for their acts. We expect um, we expect a lot of obstacles, legal, bureaucratic, and political obstacles to all the legal actions that we intend to initiate. I'm sure that many of them we will lose in first instance, and we will have to appeal and reach the highest instances of the Canadian judicial system. But people need to know that we are hell-bent on carrying on this fight until the last consequences, until the last appeal or the last judicial instance, because at the very least, we want those people who are denying the genocide in Gaza, who are not upholding their legal obligations, we want to have them on record so that history at least can judge them. So they would not be able to hide. We want to know what their positions are, and these positions are clearly stated and are on the record. So history can judge these people and potentially, eventually, right? If we sought justice also in international courts, that these international courts can consider what they did and what they did not do while a genocide was happening in Gaza.
Just one little note to add to that very good summation, Emilio, is, and you speak of we, and the we is in part Legal Center for Palestine, but it was said from the outset, we're working with the Coalition for Canadian Accountability in Gaza. And so there are a number of parties and individual legal people who are part of this campaign, and it will continue. And it's again, it's a fraught road. It's a difficult road to travel, but with effort and sumud, I guess, if I can borrow a word that you know so well, we'll reach some point where accountability does occur. Thank you, Emilio. It was wonderful talking to you again. And as someone who knows the tremendous amount of work you put into all this, it is thousands of hours over the last few years for you. It's remarkable what you and others are doing on this. Thanks very much
Thank you, Bill.
for being
Thank
here
you.
today. Okay, thank you.